Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. Hope you're all well. Today we're going to be looking at what is the second in my ongoing series of movie lists. And today we're going to be looking at, this is a book this time, 1001 Movies to See Before You Die, which if you saw my last video where I was discussing film guides, I brought this up there. I included this as one of the film guides that kind of that I bought when I was younger, and that I referred to a lot, and I still refer to actually to this day, because in a sense it kind of is a film guide, right? But it's one that attempts to form a canon by virtue of not going from A to Z, but listing 1001 movies, or including 1001 movies, I should say, that they deem worthy of seeing before anything else. Okay, so it's a list that operates by virtue of kind of inclusion and exclusion. You know, the movies that are in here are worthy of seeing, or more worthy of seeing than the movies that aren't included in here. Like I said, it's limited to 1001, and it starts right from pretty much right from the beginning of cinema. It starts from Trip to the Moon by George Méliès, which is 1902, and runs all the way through to, so this is the edition that I bought way back in 2005. So it goes up to 2005. It goes up to the present. So that's 1001 movies across, essentially speaking, kind of 100 years, right? And with each entry, you get the key. You have like a box on the side, like a panel, which tells you the kind of cast and crew details, maybe key awards that are won as well. And then you essentially have like a critical piece, talking about the kind of the virtues of the film, as it were, whether that's its importance, its innovation, its influence, or what the film has to say, what the film does very well in terms of its craft or its themes. So, and like I say, it goes through chronologically. So here, there's some entries from the 40s, and then it goes right through. You've got many pictures. It's like I said, it's a very glossy, well presented book, and essentially it's made of a lot of different contributors, a lot of different, mainly film critics, but yeah, there's also some different backgrounds. That's the list of the contributors at the front of the book. So there's a lot of them, and that's just from the 2005 edition. The contributors change over time, of course, when more movies are introduced. But for this is probably, I think, the third edition, maybe even the second edition. I'm not too sure. So I bought one of the early editions of this book, and it's, essentially the virtues of this book. There are many virtues of this book in the sense that, first off, a book that has critical pieces on 1001 movies is something which is quite, in of itself, a kind of monumental achievement, I think. It's got a group of contributors together to write these great pieces. Okay, some smaller than others, as you can see here. Like some are given a kind of a full page. Some are given, I think, even a dual page spread, on the waterfront there, for example, which kind of connotes a bit of importance, I think, about certain films over others. I think that's what it's trying to connote anyway. Some Like It Hot, for example, 2-page spread. But these pieces, nonetheless, they're great pieces that kind of encapsulate the film's virtues, as it were. And in here, like as I've already shown you, you've got some kind of notable key classics. The Apartment's another one, look. But you also have some more offbeat or quirky selections. And it covers not just American movies, but world cinema, experimental cinema, art house cinema. So, for example, here we've got Wavelength, the Michael Snow film from 1967, which is an experimental film. You've got here, Miklos Jansko's The Red and the White. It's a Hungarian, that's an art house film. So you've got plenty of different kinds of films in here, which is a great attempt at building a kind of cinematic canon that encompasses all different genres, all different styles, filmmakers from all around the world, across history and time. The best way to, the most honourable way of honouring film as both not just entertainment but an art form and as a medium, and honouring its many different aspects and virtues as a medium, right? So this is a book that I've valued since buying it 20 years ago. Still in good nick, I think, as well. And ever since, so I think 2003, like I said, was the first edition, but ever since they've updated it yearly, up until about 2020 or 2021, at least in the UK. I think there is a 2024 edition in certain countries, so it is depending on where you are. I think there's various rights complications now or something. I'm not quite sure as to why there's not a UK edition in 2024 or 2023. I think 2020 or 2021 was the last edition. But nonetheless, like I say, up until that point, every year they updated it. And that's where I begin to have issues with the book. Because the reason why this differs from a film guide and why it is a kind of, not just a reference book, but in a sense, it's a polemical book, because you're arguing really for a film's position and inclusion in this book by virtue of it being in here. Okay, so that makes it somewhat polemical. It also means it's not just, like I say, a film guide or a reference book, because you're limiting yourself conceptually to, the conceit is 1,001 movies based upon the virtues that a film holds. So by virtue of its inclusion, that means it has a certain level of greatness, or you're bestowing upon that film a particular value judgment. Now, like I say, the issues that I have with this book are in the fact that subsequent yearly editions were released, and each subsequent yearly edition was to account for the key cinematic releases of the year prior. So let's say if you had a 2020 edition released, it would cover the key notable films that were released in 2019 that were deemed commercial critical successes, supposedly. Now, like I say, I have some issues with this, which I'm about to go into, because, the thing is, what's the point in releasing an edition each year? Okay, if not, okay, obviously ostensibly to sell more copy, of course. And this was a very successful book, because I have got another edition here, and it proudly states on the front that it sold 1.6 million copies. So it was a book that did sell a lot. And, it's part of a wider series, by the way, of 1,001. They do 1,001 TV shows, 1,001 albums, 1,001 days in history or inventions. There's all sorts you can get of these. And so you think being part of a series, maybe actually the written content isn't that good or interesting? No, it is. It's really, really informative stuff and really, really good criticism across the board. I can't really fault that at all. But like I say, the point of when you start doing a new edition every single year, you actually begin to undermine the ethos of the book, its raison d'etre, why it exists. Because, like I say, it is an attempt, however you dress it up, to build a canon, okay? To present a particular canon of 1,001 films by virtue of their worthiness or esteem in a particular way. And, like I say, there's not really any point in buying each subsequent edition, unless, of course, you want to see what new movies are included, in which case you could just look up on the internet anyway. Okay, so I never bought an edition each year. But what I did do is I set myself the kind of the critical exercise about 10 years ago of buying my second edition of the book. Okay, which is this one right here with Birdman on the cover. So I have a 2005 edition and I have this 2015 edition. Okay. And like I said, I did it mainly as a kind of critical exercise for two reasons. One is to kind of note the kind of diachronic shifts that were occurring. So what I mean by that is what films were dropped out of the list and what films were put into the list over a period of 10 years. Okay, which to me would be more noticeable and instructive over a 10-year gap as opposed to just buying each edition each year, which I think is a bit, like I say, silly and pointless. So I thought it'd be an interesting critical exercise from that perspective, but also because I thought it'd be an interesting kind of ideological exercise too, because it would tell me what films supposedly meant in those 10 years between the two editions, okay? Because it should offer me a selection of films which, if its purpose is a book to illustrate or present to its reader a film canon, the last 10 years of selections should be to illustrate, like I say, what cinema meant, the best of what it could offer, what it's illustrative of as a medium, so on and so forth. Now, my main fear at the time in doing this, in buying the second edition and kind of burdening myself with that kind of critical exercise, if you like, was that in the years since the 2005 edition, the one, of course, with The Shining on the cover, that it would simply be a kind of, it would merely include a kind of hit parade of all the kind of Oscar winners and the obligatory kind of art house indie crossover success of the year. So, for example, an example of that would be in 2020. In the 2020 edition, it would have been probably Parasite or something, which is a kind of independent, or it's not a mainstream American blockbuster, but nonetheless it garnered mass critical attention and awards, and then more people saw Bong Joon-ho's film as a result of that publicity and those awards. People that wouldn't ordinarily have even heard of, let alone seen, a Bong Joon-ho film prior to that. Does that make sense? So that'd be an example of that, like a kind of art house indie crossover success. So my fear was that the book would literally just have, essentially it'd be a list of rundown of Oscar winners or contenders and the obligatory art house indie crossover success for that year, which would be a problem because it would merely reduce the book to a kind of form of self-congratulatory cinephilia that I hate, which is a kind of inevitable. It's a potential for any kind of canon formation. I think is this form of self-congratulatory circle jerk cinephilia in which you kind of list 100 movies that everyone's seen and everyone knows and everyone loves. Okay, but then what's the point? Okay, it's not really an open-minded critical exercise. It's just there to kind of tap yourself on the back to say, well, I've seen all these movies, aren't I great? So like I said, I didn't want the book reduced to that, kind of an act of cheerleading, if you will, which kind of merely reassures the reader that the only films that are important enough to be included in this book are the ones that kind of the mainstream media publications told us were important in the first place, and that we've most likely as a result already heard of and seen. Okay, so then what's the point in the book, Because it not only is that reductive to the book, it's also reductive to the art form. And it also casts, several, or fosters several dubious presuppositions. The first being that this book merely becomes reactive as opposed to proactive in the case of canon formation, right? Because it cannot offer alternative ways of thinking about and discussing a cinematic canon if it did that, because it only prescribes one that's already legitimated by, say, movie awards, hype, box office takings, visibility, essentially. We're kind of dealing with visibility politics here, okay? And that's certainly confirmed when you look at later editions of the book, because a lot of the Oscar winners are present, okay? Particularly in the years, so in the yearly edition, it would have that Oscar winner in. Later, each edition, they do little iterations and tinkerings where maybe they'd pull it out because it wasn't seen retrospectively as a great Oscar winner a couple of years later. So, for example, in this edition, 2015 edition, King's Speech isn't in here, but I think it was in like the 2011 and 12, 13 editions, for example. Yeah, so. But the fact that a lot of those key kind of award winners are in there by virtue of the fact that they've won awards and they're popular, that's problematic enough. But I think it's compounded and made worse by the fact that you have this self-imposed restriction based upon the nature of the book, 1001 Movies, that only 2 or 3 movies from each year after, say, 2003 or 4, when it was first published, make the cut. Okay? Which is not only reductive to those respective years, but it also communicates the idea that, it ignores the fact that some years are just more productive for movie fare than others. Some years are better than others, okay? Which is the case, and that's inevitable. However, the biggest problem I have with this book now is that 1,001 Movies is simply not enough. So it's 20 years since first publication. Okay, and you've got to cram in the new releases. Well, inevitably that means you've got to make way for them and remove some older ones. Okay, so this becomes clearly apparent when you look at the kind of the movies that once made the cut in favour of the more fashionable recent releases, and that's a problem in my opinion, because it not only invites the It invites the impression that kind of more recent releases, the more popular, fashionable releases, are somehow more important than the older ones, the ones that supposedly belonged to this canon in the first place. Okay. It also invites the impression that kind of sensation and reaction take precedence over serious film thought and reflection, which is the whole purpose of a canon in the first place. It actually undermines the entire ethos of the book. Okay, because if you're going to put in a new film from the last 1 or 2 years, the whole purpose of a canon formation is where time has allowed that film to marinate and which public perception may have shifted and changed, but the film sits in a place in history in regards to how we perceive it in the present. You have that kind of dialectic going on. You don't have that with modern movies from the last 1 or 2 years. It's just been released. So all you have is the immediate impression and reaction. That's not really canon formation in a kind of film criticism sense. So it kind of muddies the water a bit. And like I say, I think it undermines the entire raison d'etre or ethos of the book. Okay. So by removing some older films in favour of newer ones, you're actually making a critical stance. You're basically saying Whiplash is better than X movie, whatever it is that you've removed. Okay. And so a lot of movies, for example, just to name, like 2001, I'll pick a recent year in the book, 2001. A lot of the movies that originally made the cut for 2001, okay, are removed. They're absent in later editions of the book. For example, I've got a list here. And they're kind of inexplicably removed, really. You got David Lynch's Mulholland Drive, right, which is kind of considered one of the kind of great films of the 21st century. Isn't in the book, right? Alfonso Cuarón's Utamama Tambien was in the book, no longer in the book. Chai Ming Lang's What Time Is It There? Right? Great movie. And Chai, incidentally, one of the kind of greatest filmmakers of the 21st century. One of the great filmmakers of our time, last quarter century. Alas, isn't in the book now at all. All those films have been removed. Okay? All in favour of some kind of dubious highlight reel of recent movies. You know, Guardians of the Galaxy, Drive, Theory of Everything, Birdman, as is on the cover of this book. And so as it turns out, ironically, the selection of films from 2000 to 2005, which made the earliest editions, actually prove far more instructive and useful as reference than the later edition, than the movies included in the later edition of the same year. If that makes sense. So the movies that first made the 2000 to 2005 years in the 2005 edition prove far more insightful and instructive as to what those years offered in terms of a taste of cinema than the 2015 edition of the book. Okay? And it seems, and the reason why is because the first films to be removed are always the ones that are deemed too obscure, challenging, difficult, i.e. not mainstream enough, not rewarding instantaneously enough. And that's a justification that is given by the editor in the book, Stephen J. Snyder, right? Yeah. Who kind of says, he says, in the foreword to the book, films that are no longer stand the test of time are removed, okay? But what do we take that to mean? Because we're dealing with recent movies here. So what I take that to mean is that other films that are proved more popular, if you're just going to include them, then what's the point of a film canon? What are you for as a book, basically? Again, you're undermining the entire ethos, okay? Because if you're just going to reiterate the same films over and over, okay, ad nauseum, and relegate genuinely great or difficult and or challenging films by virtue of their difficulty or the fact that they challenge certain preconceptions the audience might have going in, into the realm of obscurity, right? Because they're not immediately available, gratifying, or deemed worthy by a select group of individuals, i.e. the writers of this book, who may or may not have seen the films in the first place. So you're creating a kind of self-perpetuating circle of movies that, because they're not visible, they'll never be visible, and the movies that are most visible, most critics have seen, therefore they'll talk about them, they get ratified as being even more the ones worthy of talking about, okay? That's a downside, like I say, almost an inevitable downside to canon formation. But when you deem yourself the impossible task of trying to cram in more movies based on 20 more years of history without changing the number, that's what's going to happen, unfortunately. So, incidentally, I find this a lot less useful now than I did originally, or a lot less useful, say, than there's an esteemed critic, Jonathan Rosenbaum, who provided his own list of 1,000 movies And even though it's based upon his personal taste and subjective though it may be, it proves far more colourful and instructive and consistent in taste and rationale than any other top 1000 list I've come across, I would say. It's a list I actually intend to go into more detail. Therefore, I would say in this case, the thing to do is expand the list. I know it's a catchy title, 1001 Movies, right? But if you've got 20 more years of history, expand it to 1,200 movies. There's nothing wrong with that, okay? Because you should expand the list, leave the more obscure works in, which is where the book's really at its most kind of revelatory and useful as a book, in my view. And then add newer entries, revising them as critical tastes change among the years that you go along, okay? So thinking about it, actually, the 1001 Movies book seems so apt when it was first published because it was at the turn of the 21st century, really. So you had 100 years of movie history, 1001 movies to choose. That's roughly 100 years per decade. It seems rather apt. Whereas now you've got to shoehorn in new titles. You haven't got just 10 decades anymore. You've got 12 and onwards, you know. So we should be working our way to 1,200 films, actually. That's what we should be doing. Incidentally, I think that there's the other book, 1001 TV series, suffers from the actual inverse problem, which is that you have a medium with only 60 years of history, and they're trying to select 1001 TV shows as representative of that. It's too many, with a medium with only 60 years history, and I actually think it's kind of still somewhat maybe too soon to try and formulate a canon, a televisual canon that big, with a medium with only 60-year history. So that suffers from the inverse problem, I think. Now, I don't want to trash the kind of later editions and iterations of this book too much. Now, on a more positive note, for example, they do reconsider some older films for consideration. They take some out and put some in. So several older films have been inaugurated into the list. For example, Ted Kotcheff's Wake in Fright. That remarkable film's in here, the Australian film. The early Antarctic expedition documentary, The Great White Silence, is in here. And the Brazilian Mario Piotto's Cine Poem Limite is in here as well, from 1931, I believe. Okay? And that's because of the tireless restorations and retrospectives that are being offered across the world is challenging the canon. And as a result, they've re-entered, or in some cases even emerged into our cinematic consciousness as a result. Something which, ironically, kind of reminds us that canons aren't really all they're cracked up to be in the first place, are they? So ironically, it's something that kind of undermines, again, the ethos and the purpose of the book. So those are my thoughts on the 1001 Movies list. And, you know, I shouldn't really call it a list, but, you know, the 1001 Movies, they do essentially form a list, don't they? The 1001 Movies book and its history and the later iterations. Probably a lot of you have read or seen this book, and maybe you own it yourself. What edition do you have? What do you think of the idea of constantly updating it with later entries? Like I say, I've raised some of the inevitable and some of the contingent problems with doing that, I think, at the expense of some older movies. But yeah, let me know your thoughts, guys, and I hope you enjoyed the video. And as always, I'll see you on the next one. If you obviously like it, like the videos that I do, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, be a part of the discussion in the comments below, and I will, like I say, see you on the next one. And I've got a few more movie lists lined up for the series. I wanted to take a look at AFI's list as well, because that's one I could rant about for a while. But I will leave you with 1001 Movies to see before you die. You know, it's a gargantuan task to get through if you actually make it your focus to get through these 1001 movies. Because, like I say, there are some very obscure films, and there's some the obvious fashionable choices. The more mainstream choices are in there as well. It's a broad church, and it's hard trying to appeal to a broad church, isn't it? So I do understand that problem as well. I'm making that book. So yeah, I'll see you on the next one in the series, but also on my other videos in general. I hope you can stick along for the ride, and take care.